Have you ever sat across from someone you love and felt powerless watching them drift further away, no matter how hard you tried to reach them? That was Jonathan Hale's reality. A billionaire CEO who could command boardrooms with a single call, yet could not get his 9-year-old autistic son, Caleb, to take a single bite of food. Imagine the weight of that silence, the judgmental stares of strangers, and the crushing fear that money cannot fix what truly matters. And then on a crowded airplane, something unexpected happened. A black waitress, Naomi Brooks, knelt beside Caleb and did what no team of specialists had achieved. With patience and compassion, she opened a door into his world. But here's the question, was this a miracle or a test? What would you do if the person society overlooked held the key to saving your family? Would you have the courage to listen, or would your pride get in the way? This is not just a story about autism. It's about dignity, love, and the choices that define us. Stay with us and see how one moment changed everything. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter. The cabin lights dimmed as Atlantic Airways Flight 762 leveled off above the clouds. Business class hummed with the quiet rustle of newspapers, the tapping of laptops, and the low murmur of conversations carried in clipped tones. At Seat 2A, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Jonathan Hale, a man known for steering billion-dollar deals with a single nod, sat rigid in his tailored Navy suit. To the world, he was invincible and unshakable leader, the CEO of Hale Global, a corporation that stretched across continents and industries. Yet in this narrow seat, he was not a titan. He was just a father, watching his 9-year-old son unravel in front of strangers. Beside him, Caleb Hale rocked back and forth, his small fists pressed tightly against his ears. The boy's breathing came in quick bursts, his eyes darting from the flickering seatbelt sign to the steady stream of passengers walking down the aisle. A flight attendant had just set a tray in front of him, grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, neatly cut vegetables. The aroma rose gently, but Caleb recoiled as if the food itself were an enemy. "Caleb, please," Jonathan whispered, his voice low but tense. "Just a bite." The boy turned away, humming softly to himself, lost in a world that Jonathan could not enter. Around them, other passengers shifted uncomfortably. A man in a gray blazer cleared his throat pointedly. A woman across the aisle gave a sympathetic but weary glance, the kind that said she had already judged. Jonathan felt the familiar burn in his chest, the mix of frustration and shame that never seemed to leave him. He could negotiate mergers, outthink rivals, and command armies of employees, but he could not get his son to eat. He picked up the fork, tried cutting the chicken into smaller pieces. "Look, buddy, just like at home. One bite, and then you can rest." His words sounded more like a plea than a promise. Caleb shut his eyes tight and began to rock harder, humming louder now. The sound drew more stares. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He hated the scrutiny, the whispers. He hated the way strangers saw his son as a problem, a disruption. Most of all, he hated that he could do nothing to shield him. And then, quietly, someone stepped closer. The voice was gentle, carrying no judgment, only calm. "Would you like me to help?" Jonathan looked up, startled. Standing in the aisle was a black flight attendant with kind eyes and an air of patience that seemed to slow the chaos around her. Her name tag read Naomi Brooks. He almost refused. He was used to doing things alone, to guarding his pride. But the way Naomi knelt so that her eyes met Caleb's without towering over him without demanding, caught him off guard. She didn't speak to Jonathan. She didn't even look at the tray. She simply began to hum, soft at first, a melody that threaded its way through the air. Not a song Jonathan recognized at once, but Caleb did. The boy's rocking slowed, his head tilting slightly toward the sound. Naomi hummed again, adding a gentle rhythm with her fingers tapping the armrest, as though creating a bridge from her world to his. Then, with deliberate care, she lifted the fork, speared a small piece of chicken, and moved it in a slow arc, mimicking the pattern Caleb had been tracing in the air. Jonathan watched, his chest tightening. For 2 years, no therapist, no specialist, no matter how expensive, had managed to reach his son this way. Yet here, in a crowded airplane cabin, a stranger seemed to hold the key. Caleb's eyes opened. For the first time on this flight, they locked on someone's face not fleetingly, not by accident, but steady, as if Naomi's calm presence had pulled him into the moment. And then, miracle of miracles, he leaned forward. Naomi's hand did not waver. The fork reached his lips. Slowly, hesitantly, Caleb opened his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. Jonathan's eyes stung. He sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe, as his son, his silent, unreachable son, took another bite. Around them, the cabin seemed to pause. Even the impatient man in the gray blazer turned his gaze away, his frown softening. The hum of the engines filled the silence as if to bear witness. Naomi smiled not triumphantly, not with pride, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen this before and knew it could happen again. Jonathan managed to find his voice. How? How did you do that? Naomi didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Caleb, humming softly, steady and patient. Sometimes, she said, you just have to speak his language. For the first time in months, Jonathan felt something loosen in his chest. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was hope. The seatbelt sign clicked off with a soft chime, but the tension in Jonathan's shoulders did not. He thanked Naomi in a hushed voice as she eased the tray closer to Caleb, still guiding the fork in the slow, floating arcs. The boy watched every movement, his breathing evening out. Another bite, then another, small victories that, to a father, felt like mountains moved. For a few minutes, Jonathan allowed himself to simply watch. Naomi's humming wove in and out like a calm current, the melody changing slightly whenever Caleb's gaze drifted or his fingers fluttered. She noticed everything. The twitch in his left hand when a cart rattled down the aisle, the way he preferred to look at the food from the side, not head-on, the way fluorescent light reflected off metal edges. She adjusted to each signal without fanfare, as if she had been doing this her whole life. The man in the gray blazer leaned across the aisle, voice low. I didn't realize. It's good he has you. He nodded at Jonathan, then at Naomi. Both of you. Jonathan's instinct was to brace for condescension, but the man's expression carried no complaint now, only a quiet apology. Jonathan nodded back. Thanks. It came out clipped, but not cold. Naomi set the fork down and offered Caleb a small napkin folded like a bird. He traced the crease with one fingertip, then tucked it into the corner of his tray as if saving it. Naomi rose, careful and unhurried. I'll check on you in a bit, she said softly. If he needs a quieter corner, I can dim the overhead and bring a small reading light. Softer glow, less flicker. Jonathan blinked. You can do that. I can try, she said. and the faintest spark of humor warmed her eyes. They let me do a few things on this airplane. When she stepped away, Jonathan felt the familiar pull of work, his phone, face down on the side table, a silent galaxy of unanswered messages. He didn't need to flip it over to see the headlines that might be waiting. The markets, the board, a regulatory update on the data center spinoff. Hale Global never slept. But right now, his world had narrowed to the rectangle of a tray table and a boy who was finally eating. He inhaled and exhaled, slow. Then he noticed the imprint his name made on the cabin. It happened often, even when he wasn't trying. The small delays that smoothed out when a gate agent checked a screen. The sideways glances from other executives travel in the same corridors of power. The way people said Mr. Hale with half respect, half calculation. The weight of being a black man who had climbed to the top of an industry that did not build its ladders for him. Power could bend rooms, but it could not open the door to his son's world. He looked at Caleb. The boy's lips moved soundlessly, forming patterns only he knew, his shoulders softening with each chew. Jonathan felt the old ache rise again, the ache of hospital rooms and long drives where silence pressed so hard it felt like a second atmosphere. The ache of being told, over and over, he should consider expectation adjustments, as if love itself needed a corporate reforecast. A flight attendant pushed the cart past. The wheels vibrated against the aisle seam. Caleb startled, clutching his wrists against his chest. Jonathan reached for his hand. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, then caught himself and lowered his voice further. "Okay, you're safe." Naomi reappeared, almost as if she had felt the shift from across the cabin. She flicked the overhead briefly, then off, then brought a slim clip-on light, angling it so the beam fell soft and golden across the tray. The harsh flicker disappeared. Caleb's shoulders eased. "Thank you," Jonathan said. He meant it more than the words could carry. Naomi nodded once. "You can lower your phone brightness when you use it," she added in a whisper. Some screens flicker at frequencies that are hard to see, but he might feel them. She scanned Caleb's face, then glanced at Jonathan. "Do you have noise reduction earbuds?" "Just one. Turned down low. For the card and chimes?" Jonathan opened the small leather pouch in his briefcase. He always traveled with 2 sets. He handed her one. Naomi crouched so she could show it to Caleb first, then to him, slow and predictable. She guided the earbud to the boy's ear as if offering a seashell. He did not resist. He did not flinch. The cabin's mechanical whir flattened into a softer tide. "Better?" Naomi asked. Caleb did not answer, but he took another bite. Naomi stood to go again, but Jonathan felt something swell in his throat. "How did you learn all this?" He wanted to ask more, but the questions crowded each other. "Where did you train? How many children like my son have you helped? Where were you when I was making the wrong decisions? When my pen turned into an axe, her answer came like a bookmark slipped between pages. "I used to teach," she said, almost casually. "A lifetime ago." He watched her walk back toward the galley, and a memory unspooled. A conference room high above Midtown, the evening sky turning the windows a bruised violet, board members fidgeting as he moved the meeting along. Budgets, projections, a spreadsheet with a red column labeled non-core programs. The education division lead had cautioned him. "We'll lose community partnerships. There are therapeutic services in here." Jonathan had thought like a CEO, optimize, streamline, trust the line item, not the anecdote. The vote had been unanimous. The signatures, automatic. He had been celebrated the next quarter for improving margins. Now, in this pressurized tube, the old praise tasted like ash. Caleb reached for the folded napkin bird and brushed it against his cheek. Jonathan smiled despite himself. He leaned in. "That's a good friend to keep," he said. "You and Mr. Bird." Caleb's eyes flicked to his, clear and brief as a dragonfly over water. Then he tucked the paper bird into the pocket of the seat in front. A shadow passed. The gray blazer man stood, waiting for the aisle to clear. He hesitated, then spoke again. "I have a nephew," he said quietly to Jonathan, eyes on nothing in particular. "He's 10. It's hard sometimes." He swallowed. "It helps to see someone trying." Jonathan nodded. "It helps to hear that." He surprised himself by adding, softly, "Thank you." The man moved on. "Jonah, no," Jonathan corrected himself wryly. As if a stranger's name could rewrite his own, Jonathan took another breath. He turned his phone over. The lock screen lit the cabin with a small moon of light. He lowered the brightness. Messages bloomed. A request for a media quote on an antitrust rumor. A note from legal about a hearing date that had shifted into next week. A text from his ex-wife. "Victoria, call me. It's important." He locked the screen again. He wasn't ready to open that door. Not here. Not when his son's calm was still a fragile bridge. Naomi returned with a small cup of applesauce. "Sometimes a different texture after protein helps," she said. "It changes the rhythm. New step, same dance." He almost smiled. "You talk like you choreograph this. Kids like Caleb teach you the steps," she said. "If you listen." She offered the spoon to Caleb. "Handle first." He took it, turned it once, then dipped it and tasted. His lips twitched into something like approval. Jonathan watched the spoon rise and fall, in a slow, steady cadence. It felt like witnessing the tide relearn the shore. "Does he like deep pressure?" Naomi asked. "Weighted blankets, firm hugs with warning." "Sometimes," Jonathan said, surprised she could read it. "At night? He sleeps better when I put my arm across his back, but only after I tell him I will." She nodded. Consent, even in comfort. The phrase landed inside him with a weight all its own. In conference rooms, he commanded. In acquisitions, he conquered. At home, he tried to remember if he had ever asked. Asked before picking his son up. Asked before moving a plate. Asked before shifting a plan. The answer bruised him. Naomi checked the seat row behind them, then to the side. "If you want, I can show you a breathing game. Helps when there's a sudden noise or a crowd. You do it with him, not to him." "I want," he said. It sounded like a confession and a vow. They practiced in whispers. Naomi traced a square in the air with her finger. Up for 4 beats. Hold for 4. Down for 4. Hold for 4. Caleb watched, then copied, his finger floating like a small sail, catching an invisible wind. When a cupboard clinked in the galley, he flinched and then, on his own, drew another square, slow and sure. Jonathan closed his eyes for a second. The humiliation of countless public scenes, the pity, the hidden sneers, they did not vanish, but they lost their grip. In their place, a different story began to write itself, a story with steps he could learn. The captain's voice slid over the intercom, smooth and practiced. Weather over the Midwest was clear. Estimated time to arrival, 5 hours and 14 minutes. Jonathan pictured the time as a gift wrapped in white noise and artificial sky. He could squander it on emails and signatures, or he could spend it tracing squares with his son. He chose, and it felt like choosing himself. When Naomi eased away again, Jonathan found words that did not feel like armor. "Thank you," he said, "not just for the food, for this language." She tilted her head, receiving the gratitude without ceremony. "You're speaking it," she said. "He hears you." Jonathan looked at Caleb. The boy had arranged peas and bits of chicken into a constellation only he could name. He tapped each star in an order that mattered to him, then let his hand rest. "How's your hand?" Jonathan asked, nodding to Caleb's left wrist. Caleb looked at it as if remembering it existed. Then he placed it palm down on the armrest, open. Jonathan laid his own hand beside it, not covering, not forcing, just there, close enough that, if Caleb wanted, he could bridge the gap. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the boy slid his pinky to touch his father's ring finger, a tiny, precise connection, a quiet yes. Jonathan swallowed. The engines filled the silence with a steady lullaby. From the galley. Naomi watched from a respectful distance. Her face was unreadable in the dim light professional composure. Yes, but also the private knowledge of someone who had seen 1,000 tiny miracles and still treated each one as if it were the first. She turned to adjust something on the service cart. When she looked back, the small connection remained. Jonathan thought of the weight of a name, the name on skyscrapers, on contracts, on tabloids that reduced people to captions, and then the name that mattered now, simple and small, spoken in a whisper when the world got loud, Daddy. He let the hope in. He let it take a seat. The hours in the sky stretched long and quiet, a rare pause in Jonathan's usual calendar of urgency. He sat with his son in that fragile peace, watching the rise and fall of Caleb's chest as the boy hummed softly to himself, spoon still in hand. The cabin carried the muted rhythm of a long-haul flight, subdued conversations. The clink of cups, the steady pulse of engines that had become almost like a heartbeat. Jonathan leaned back, loosening his tie. His mind tugged between the world he controlled and the small world he barely understood. He thought of the boardrooms where his name carried gravity, where one sentence could shift millions of dollars. Here, none of it mattered. In this narrow seat, his power dissolved into the simple question of whether his son would sleep without trembling, whether he would eat more than a few bites before retreating inward again. Naomi returned quietly, her presence more like a calming tide than a disruption. She crouched once more at Caleb's eye level, placing a small cup of pudding on the tray. Without a word, she tapped a rhythm on the plastic lid steady, patient. Caleb's eyes lit faintly, following the beat. He tapped back, tentative at first, then more certain. Naomi smiled, not broadly, but in that way that told Jonathan she recognized progress when others might miss it. "He likes patterns," she said softly, turning to Jonathan. "When you join them, he feels understood. It's not about forcing him into our world, it's about showing him his language has value." Jonathan tried. He tapped the same rhythm, a little clumsy at first. Caleb looked at him, then tapped again, adjusting the beat until it matched both Naomi's and his father's. 3 rhythms becoming one. Jonathan felt a strange warmth spread in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in months. He cleared his throat, voice unsteady. "You make it look so easy." Naomi shook her head. It's not easy, but it is simple. Listen more than you speak. Follow before you lead." She paused, her eyes flicking to the window, where streaks of moonlight traced the wing. Children like Caleb, they notice the world differently. That doesn't make them broken. It makes them beautiful in ways most people overlook. Jonathan swallowed hard. He wanted to believe that. He needed to. But behind her words, he heard the echo of board meetings, the cold language of efficiency, the decisions that had cut away programs for children just like his son. His signature had ended careers, shuttered classrooms, extinguished possibilities. He had justified it as optimization. Now, he wondered if what he had really done was amputate hope. Caleb licked the spoon of pudding, then pushed it toward his father. Jonathan hesitated, then mimicked the pattern on the lid again. Caleb's lips twitched something almost like a smile, and he ate another spoonful. Naomi rose, giving them space. She checked on another passenger, then another, her movements precise yet unhurried. To Jonathan, she looked less like a flight attendant and more like a conductor guiding a fragile orchestra. Every detail mattered: the flicker of lights, the rhythm of footsteps in the aisle, the timbre of voices lowered to a hush. Jonathan turned inward. He thought of the day Caleb had been diagnosed, the sterile office, the doctor's careful tone, the words that landed like stones: autism spectrum disorder. He had nodded, already calculating therapies, specialists, costs, believing money could solve what love had not yet been allowed to. But money had not cracked the silence. Money had not taught him how to reach across the invisible glass wall around his child. Tonight, on a plane, a stranger with a gentle voice had done more in minutes than Jonathan's resources had in years. He felt shame tighten his chest, but also a flicker of gratitude. Maybe, he thought, he had been looking in the wrong places all along. Naomi returned with a blanket. She unfolded it, showing it to Caleb first, letting him touch the edge. "Would you like this over your lap?" she asked, not assuming, not rushing. Caleb nodded slightly. She draped it across his knees, tucking the corners in a way that felt more like security than restraint. The boy exhaled, shoulders relaxing into the seat. Jonathan whispered, "How do you know to ask like that?" She looked at him. Steady. Consent is a language too. He deserves the choice. The words struck deeper than he expected. Jonathan had built an empire on commands, on quick decisions executed without pause. Consent was not a word that entered corporate vocabulary. Yet here, on this flight, it felt like the most important word in the world. Caleb leaned into his seat, eyes half closed now. Naomi stepped back. Jonathan studied her face in the dim light, calm, composed, but shadowed by something he couldn't name. A weight, a past. He wanted to ask, but the question lodged behind his pride. Instead, he said quietly, "You've given me more tonight than any consultant ever has." Naomi inclined her head, neither accepting nor rejecting the praise. "He gave it to you." She said, "I only translated." Jonathan turned toward the window. The night sky stretched endless and silent, speckled with stars he could not name. He wondered if Caleb saw patterns in them, connections invisible to others. He wondered if maybe the problem had never been that his son didn't speak his language, but that he had never learned his son's. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan let his mind drift without the chains of schedules and numbers. He thought of what might change if he truly listened. He thought of what he owed not just to Caleb, but to children like him, to teachers like Naomi, who had been pushed aside when margins mattered more than lives. He pressed a hand to his eyes, forcing back tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. When he lowered it, Caleb's head had tipped gently against his arm, not by accident, not by force, by choice. Jonathan froze, hardly daring to breathe. Then, slowly, he let his arm rest where it was, cradling the fragile trust like something holy. Naomi, standing at the far end of the cabin, looked back once. She saw the boy leaning, the father still as stone, the first bridge spanning what had felt like an ocean. She did not smile. She simply nodded to herself, then turned to her duties, letting the moment belong to them. Jonathan whispered into the hush, words he wasn't sure Caleb heard. "I'm here. Son, I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in years, he almost believed it himself. The cabin lights dimmed further as the attendants prepared passengers for rest. Some reclined their seats, others slipped on eye masks or opened laptops. But Jonathan found himself awake, restless, his mind circling the same question. Who was this woman? Naomi Brooks moved through the aisle with quiet efficiency. To anyone else, she looked like any skilled flight attendant, smiling, calm, professional. Yet Jonathan had seen enough in her manner with Caleb to know there was more beneath the uniform. Every movement she made with his son carried knowledge that went beyond hospitality training. She had anticipated Caleb's needs before he expressed them, recognized his signals before Jonathan himself could interpret them. That was not coincidence. That was experience. When she returned to check on them, Jonathan seized the moment. "Naomi," he said, keeping his voice low so Caleb could sleep, "you told me earlier you used to teach. What did you mean by that?" She hesitated, eyes flicking briefly to Caleb before answering. "I was a special education teacher, worked with children on the autism spectrum, ADHD, developmental delays, 8 years in the classroom." Jonathan blinked. 8 years. Yes. Her voice was steady, but there was a thread of wistfulness woven through it. It was the work I loved most. But the program shut down when funding was cut. Overnight, the children lost their classrooms. The staff lost their jobs. Jonathan felt a pinch in his chest. He remembered the memos. He remembered the meetings where spreadsheets replaced stories, non-core programs, not cost-effective. He had signed off on those cuts at Hale Global when their education division was bleeding money. He hadn't thought about the human fallout until now. What happened after that, he asked carefully. Naomi looked down at her hands, fingers brushing the hem of her uniform. "I tried to fight it at first. Petitioned the board, wrote letters, begged donors. Nothing worked. I worked odd jobs, waitressing mostly. When my mother got sick, I needed steady income and health benefits. Airline work was hiring. I wasn't teaching, but it kept the bills paid." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Jonathan caught the weight behind her words. Years of passion repackaged into survival. A life's calling reduced to a uniform and a cart rolling down narrow aisles. "Did you ever think of going back?" Jonathan pressed, though part of him already feared the answer. Naomi's eyes softened as she glanced again at Caleb, his small frame curled under the blanket. "Every day. But doors don't open easily when your program was labeled a financial failure. The industry doesn't see the worth. Not until a child belongs to someone powerful enough to make them notice." Jonathan's stomach twisted. Her words weren't cruel. They were simple truth, and they landed heavier because he knew deep down He had been part of the system that dismissed her worth. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice quieter now. "You must miss it." Naomi didn't answer right away. She studied Caleb's steady breathing, the way his hand clutched the paper napkin bird she'd folded for him earlier. Finally, she said, "I miss being useful in the way that mattered, teaching children like him to be seen, not overlooked. That's what broke me most, not the paycheck, not the title. The silence that followed when society moved on, as if those kids had disappeared." Jonathan swallowed hard. He could almost hear the echo of his own boardroom voice cut the program. Focus on scalable impact. Back then, it had sounded strategic. Now, it sounded merciless. "Naomi," he began, but she lifted a hand gently, stopping him. "You don't have to explain," she said softly. "I've seen plenty of fathers carry guilt. It won't help Caleb tonight. What will help is showing up, moment after moment, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Her words stilled him. She wasn't accusing him. She wasn't absolving him either. She was reminding him that the work of love was relentless, ordinary, unglamorous, and more vital than any contract he'd ever signed. For a moment, Jonathan wanted to confess everything, that it was his own company's cuts that had dismantled her world, that he had been blind to the ripple effect of his own decisions. But the words stuck in his throat. He feared what her eyes might look like if she knew. Instead, he asked quietly, "Why did you help us tonight? You could have just done your job, brought the meal, cleared the tray, moved on. Why step in?" Naomi thought for a long moment. "Because I saw him," she said finally, "and I know what it's like to be invisible." The answer pierced Jonathan more deeply than any rebuke could have. He looked at his son, asleep but calmer than he had been in weeks, and felt the sting of tears press against his eyes. He blinked them away, not out of pride this time, but because he didn't want to miss a second of this fragile peace. Naomi rose, smoothing her skirt. "Get some rest if you can," she said. "It will make a difference for him to wake up and see you steady." Jonathan nodded, words caught in his throat. He watched her move back toward the galley, each step unhurried, as if she carried a gravity that balanced the cabin itself. He leaned back, resting his head against the seat. For the first time on a plane, the hum of the engines didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a lullaby. He let his eyes close, one hand resting lightly near Caleb's, close enough for connection if the boy reached out, before sleep claimed him. A thought pressed in with clarity. This woman had once held the future of children like Caleb in her hands, and the world had failed to value it. I failed to value it. Now fate, or maybe grace, had seated her beside his son, mid-air, forcing him to see what he had ignored. As the plane cut through the night sky, Jonathan made a silent vow. He would not ignore it again. The steady hum of the engines worked like a bomb, carrying the cabin deeper into the stillness of night. A few passengers had settled under blankets, their faces softened by dimmed lights. Jonathan stayed awake, his gaze fixed on Caleb. The boy's breathing was steady, his head tipped slightly against his shoulder. Jonathan had spent years fearing silence. It had always been the space where doubts grew, but now the silence was different. It wasn't heavy or hostile. It was fragile, yes, but also healing. Caleb was not shutting him out. He was resting near him. That difference felt monumental. Naomi returned, her steps soft, carrying 2 cups of warm chamomile tea. She placed one on Jonathan's tray and kept the other in her hands. "You'll need this," she whispered. "Sometimes parents forget to breathe when they're so focused on their children." Jonathan accepted the cup, surprised by how natural her presence had become. "You notice everything," he murmured. She gave a small shrug. "It's habit. Teaching taught me to pay attention to the smallest signs. That's where the truth usually lives." He sipped the tea, letting its warmth settle in his chest. For a man used to expensive scotch and rare wines, the simple drink felt more grounding than any luxury. After a few minutes, Caleb stirred, opening his eyes just enough to shift in his seat. Jonathan stiffened, expecting the rockin' to return, but Naomi crouched quickly at his level, tapping a gentle rhythm on the armrest. Caleb blinked, then tapped back, slower this time, before leaning once more into his father's side. Jonathan exhaled, relief washing over him. "You make it seem so possible," he admitted. Naomi tilted her head, her eyes soft. "It is possible. He's showing you the way. You just need to let him lead sometimes." Her words stayed with him, stirring something deeper. He thought of his life, the endless meetings, the relentless drive, the way he commanded every space. Letting someone else lead was foreign. Yet, watching Caleb, Jonathan realized leadership wasn't always about power. Sometimes it was about humility. As the flight moved into its 4th hour, Jonathan and Naomi found themselves talking in hushed voices while Caleb slept again. "What do you think he dreams about?" Jonathan asked quietly, surprising himself with the question. Naomi smiled faintly. "Maybe patterns, maybe colors, maybe a world that feels less noisy than this one." She looked at Caleb thoughtfully. "But maybe he dreams of connection too, even if he doesn't say it." Jonathan's throat tightened. "I want to give him that, but most days I feel like I'm failing." Naomi's gaze met his. "Failure is walking away. You're still here." Jonathan looked down at his son, small fingers curled loosely against his sleeve. "I wasn't always here," he confessed, voice thick. "I hid in work, buried myself in it. It felt easier than facing how little I knew how to help him." Naomi's reply was gentle but firm. "Children don't remember every mistake. They remember whether you came back." The words hit him harder than he expected. He thought of the countless nights he had arrived home too late, the mornings when Caleb's breakfast plate had been cold before Jonathan appeared. Yet here, now, on this flight, he was present. Maybe presence could still matter. Caleb shifted again, eyes half opening, and Jonathan instinctively reached out, not to force, not to command, but to simply place his hand near his son's. Caleb's fingers twitched, then rested over his. Jonathan froze, then let the warmth of that small gesture sink into his chest like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Naomi noticed, her lips curving into the smallest smile. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The hours passed like beads on a string. Sometimes Caleb would wake, hum, or tap, and Naomi would guide Jonathan through it. Other times, Jonathan found himself just watching, learning how to read his son's cues, the twitch of his eyes when he needed quiet, the way his rocking slowed when he was comfortable, the faint lift of his shoulders when he felt safe. Each sign felt like a secret Jonathan was finally being allowed to learn. At one point, Jonathan asked Naomi, "Do you think he'll ever talk again?" Naomi paused before answering. "I don't know, but words aren't the only language. You've heard him tonight, haven't you?" Jonathan looked at his son, at the way Caleb's hand remained loosely wrapped around his. "Yes," he whispered. "I've heard him." The cabin grew quieter as midnight stretched on. Jonathan realized, with a clarity that startled him, that he didn't want this flight to end. Not because he feared landing, but because he feared losing the fragile thread of connection they had found. Naomi must have sensed his unease. "This doesn't have to end when the plane lands," she said softly. "The world will try to make you forget. But what matters is whether you choose to remember." Jonathan studied her, wondering how she could read what he hadn't spoken aloud. "You've given me more than I know how to thank you for," he admitted. Naomi shook her head. "Thank him," she said, nodding at Caleb. "He's the one who let you in." Jonathan turned, looking at his son with new eyes. He realized Naomi was right. The bridge wasn't built by her alone. Caleb had allowed it by choice, by trust, by the quiet courage of a child who wanted to be seen. Jonathan's throat tightened again. "Thank you, Caleb," he whispered. Caleb's eyes fluttered open briefly, and in that half-dreaming state, he pressed his small hand more firmly against his father's. Jonathan closed his eyes, holding on to that moment as if it were a promise. When dawn began to edge along the horizon, casting pale light into the cabin, Jonathan felt something inside him shift. He had boarded this flight as a CEO with more power than most men could imagine, but somewhere over the clouds, he had become something he had longed for, but had nearly forgotten how to be. A father. Morning came quietly. Pale light filtered through the cabin windows, washing the space in soft gold. Passengers stirred, stretching stiff limbs, asking for coffee. Jonathan opened his eyes to find Caleb still resting against him. Small breaths rising and falling with a rhythm steadier than Jonathan had heard in months. For a fleeting moment, he let himself believe they were safe in this bubble above the earth, untouchable. But the world always had a way of catching up. When the plane touched down at O'Hare, the usual scramble began, phones lighting up, bags pulled from overhead bins, voices rising with impatience. Jonathan glanced at his phone, reluctant to unlock it. But curiosity and dread won. 17 missed calls, 9 messages, and at the top, Victoria Lang. His stomach tightened. The first text read, "We need to talk. Urgent. It's about Caleb." The second I saw the photos, "Don't play games with me. Jonathan." And then, the last, "If you think this is stable for him, you're proving my case." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He didn't need to ask which photos she meant. Cameras had found him weeks earlier slipping into restaurants with Caleb, always seated in the same section. Naomi had been in some of those frames, her uniform unmistakable. Tabloids had spun their stories. Billionaire CEO and Waitress whisperer spotted again, new romance or desperate parenting. He had ignored them at first, but Victoria. She would never ignore an opportunity. The crowd pressed toward the aisle. Naomi approached with her practiced calm. "We'll deplane from the front," she said. Her eyes flicked to Jonathan, reading his tension before he spoke. "Rough messages," Jonathan gave a humorless smile. "You could say that." He showed her the screen briefly. Naomi's lips pressed together, but she didn't ask questions. She simply touched Caleb's shoulder lightly, guiding him with care toward the exit. Jonathan followed, shoulders squared, as if bracing against a storm. In the arrivals hall, the storm was waiting. Victoria Lang stood near baggage claim, flawless in a tailored cream suit. her heels clicking against polished tile. Even here. She looked like a woman posing for a magazine feature. At 42, she carried herself with the sharp elegance of someone who never allowed life to wrinkle her edges. But her eyes, icy, piercing, were fixed on Jonathan, then flicked to Caleb, then lingered on Naomi. "So, this is her," Victoria said without preamble. The flight attendant turned miracle worker. Her voice carried just enough volume to attract glances from nearby travelers. Naomi stiffened but kept her composure. "Ms. Lang," she said evenly. "I was only doing my job." "Your job," Victoria repeated, her tone laced with disdain. "Interesting, because from where I stand, it looks like you've inserted yourself into my son's life in ways that are highly inappropriate." Jonathan stepped between them. "Enough. Victoria, she's helped Caleb more than anyone in years. If you'd seen him on that flight, I didn't need to." Victoria cut in sharply. "I've seen the headlines. Do you think the court will care about your sentimental anecdotes when there are photographs of you parading our son through public spectacles with staff?" Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides. "Don't reduce her to that. She's more qualified than anyone you've ever brought around Caleb." Victoria arched a brow. "Qualified. She wears a uniform and serves drinks. Let's not romanticize it." Naomi's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. Her silence was dignified, not submissive. Jonathan noticed and admired that restraint. Caleb pressed against his father's leg, sensing the rising tension. Jonathan crouched, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe." He lowered his voice, softening it the way Naomi had taught him. Caleb's humming steadied. Victoria's gaze hardened. "This is exactly my point. He needs stability, routine. Not to be dragged around on flights and coddled by strangers. I'll be filing for custody." The words landed like a blade. Jonathan rose slowly, eyes locked on her. "You walked away. Victoria. You left when the diagnosis didn't fit your perfect picture. Don't you dare come back now because you see leverage." Her smile was sharp. "Practiced. I left because you were never there, and I'll prove it in court." Naomi shifted, as if to speak, but Jonathan shook his head subtly. He didn't want her dragged into Victoria's game more than she already was. A man in a dark suit appeared at Victoria's side, her lawyer. No doubt. He held a sleek leather folder. "Mr. Hale," he said formally, "you'll be served within 48 hours. Ms. Lang is seeking full custody. We'll argue that the current environment is harmful and unstable." His eyes flicked to Naomi, the implication unmistakable. Jonathan felt his pulse hammering, the same way it did before high-stakes negotiations. But this wasn't about a company. This was about Caleb, and for the first time in years he felt utterly vulnerable. Naomi touched his arm lightly. "Don't let him see you unravel," she whispered. Her words steadied him. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then turned back to Victoria. "Do whatever you need to, but understand this. Caleb isn't leverage. He isn't a trophy, and he isn't going to be used to repair your image." Victoria's smile didn't falter. "We'll see what the judge thinks." She pivoted, her heels clicking sharply as she walked away with her lawyer. Jonathan stood frozen, the echo of her words still ringing in his ears. Naomi finally spoke. "She's not going to stop. I know," Jonathan said quietly. His eyes moved to Caleb, who had retreated into a soft hum, rocking slightly against his side. Jonathan bent down, holding his son close without forcing it, murmuring, "I've got you. Buddy, no one's taken you away. Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder. Then you'll have to fight. Not just with money, with truth. Jonathan nodded, the weight of the battle settling on him. He had faced hostile takeovers, lawsuits, regulatory wars. None of it had felt as terrifying as this, the possibility of losing his son. As they walked toward the exit, Jonathan knew one thing with certainty. This was no longer just about a father and his child. It was about a system that had failed them both, and about whether he had the courage to confront it head-on. The courthouse loomed over downtown Chicago like a slab of stone, its marble columns catching the late morning sun. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward as Jonathan emerged from the back of a black SUV. He straightened his tie, the weight of Caleb's small hand in his own, reminding him what was truly at stake. Inside, the air was heavy with the low hum of voices and the clatter of shoes against polished floors. Jonathan felt the familiar pressure of an arena, though this one was more hostile than any boardroom he had ever faced. His company's reputation could survive bad headlines. His son's future could not survive the wrong verdict. Victoria was already seated at the petitioner's table, flawless as ever in a dark navy suit. Her lawyer, Bennett Shaw, whispered in her ear before glancing toward Jonathan with the predator's cool confidence. Jonathan sat down with his own legal team, though his eyes kept straying toward the gallery where Caleb sat with Naomi. The boy hummed quietly, tracing the edge of a toy car along the wooden bench. Naomi sat beside him, her posture calm, her presence grounding him. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled back tightly, entered with solemn efficiency. "This court will come to order," she declared. Opening arguments cut through the air like blades. Shaw painted Jonathan as a negligent father, too busy with corporate empires to provide the stability his son required. He gestured toward Naomi, seated quietly. "And now, we have an airline employee, however well-meaning, stepping into a role that should never have been hers. This is not stability. This is desperation." Jonathan's attorney, a seasoned advocate named Marjorie Kane, countered swiftly. "Mr. Hale has provided every resource, every ounce of commitment to his son. What opposing counsel calls desperation, we call devotion. Caleb has thrived under the care of those who understand him, including Miss Brooks, whose qualifications extend far beyond her uniform." Jonathan kept his face composed, but inside he seethed. They spoke of his son as if he were a liability, a bargaining chip, a pawn. He gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. Witnesses came and went, therapists, doctors, even a school administrator. Each spoke in clipped, careful tones, some leaning toward Jonathan's side, others reinforcing Victoria's narrative of chaos. But the tension in the courtroom shifted when Naomi was called to the stand. She walked to the front with quiet dignity, her black dress plain but pressed, her steps steady despite the barrage of camera shutters clicking. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore her oath, and sat. Shaw approached first. "Miss Brooks, you are a flight attendant, correct?" "Yes," Naomi replied evenly. "And your formal role with Caleb Hale is none. I'm not employed as his caregiver. No." Shaw turned to the jury, his voice dripping skepticism. "So tell us, Ms. Brooks, what qualifies you to feed, soothe, or guide a child who isn't yours? Isn't it true you simply inserted yourself into this situation?" Naomi met his gaze without flinching. What qualifies me is 8 years as a licensed special education teacher. I worked with more than 200 children with autism, ADHD, and developmental delays. I have a master's degree in special education from Columbia University, and what you call inserting myself. I call seeing a child in distress and choosing not to look away. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Shaw narrowed his eyes. Yet, you left that profession. Why, Naomi's voice steadied, growing stronger with each word. Because funding was cut, my program was shut down. The company that pulled that funding was Hale Global. Mr. Hale's company. I lost my job, my classroom, and my students because someone decided children like Caleb were not cost-effective. The courtroom buzzed. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. He had known this truth, carried it like a stone in his chest. Now the world knew it too. Naomi continued, her voice resonating in the silence. So yes, I now serve meals on airplanes. But when I see a child like Caleb, I don't see a burden. I see a gift. I see possibility. And when he reached for me, I didn't hesitate. Not because I wanted to replace his parents, but because love doesn't wait for permission. Shaw faltered, then regrouped. So you expect us to believe your involvement is purely altruistic, that you expect nothing in return? Naomi's gaze softened, shifting toward Caleb. The boy had paused his humming, watching her with rare stillness. The only thing I expect, she said quietly, is for him to know he is not invisible. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge's stern features softened for a brief moment. Kane rose for cross-examination. Ms. Brooks, what have you observed in Jonathan Hale's parenting? Naomi folded her hands. I have seen a man who is learning. A man who once believed power came from control, but is discovering it also comes from presence. I have seen him listen to his son in ways that matter. That doesn't make him perfect, but it makes him a father who shows up. Jonathan's throat tightened. It was not absolution, but it was truth. When Naomi stepped down, Jonathan caught her eye. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to thank her for carrying truths heavier than most men could bear, but words failed him. She gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "This isn't about me. This is about him." The hearing continued. But the air had shifted. Naomi's testimony lingered, echoing in every corner of the room. For the first time, Jonathan sensed Victoria losing her grip. Her mask of perfection cracked ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around her pen until her knuckles paled. As the judge called for recess, Jonathan turned to look at Caleb. The boy tapped his toy car against the bench twice, then pressed it into his father's hand. Jonathan stared at it, realizing his son was offering more than a toy. He was offering trust. Jonathan bent down, whispering so only Caleb could hear, "I won't let them take you. Not now. Not ever." And for the first time, he believed his words carried the strength to make it true. The courtroom reconvened after recess. Tension wound tighter than before. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Every glance, every whisper carried the weight of spectacle. Jonathan sat tall, but beneath his tailored suit, his chest ached with the pressure of truths he had avoided too long. Victoria rose, her composure sharpened to a blade. She stood before the judge with elegance and venom perfectly balanced. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, cutting through the room, "we are here because a child deserves better than instability. Caleb deserves safety, Not scenes in restaurants, not late nights in airports, not improvised parenting strategies from strangers. He deserves a home. What Jonathan Hale offers is chaos dressed in money. She pivoted, eyes drilling into Jonathan. This is a man who built an empire by cutting costs, including programs that would have helped children like his own. Ask yourself if he could sacrifice other people's children for profit. What does that say about his commitment to his own? Gasps rippled through the gallery. Jonathan's fists tightened. Every word was a spear, but the worst part was that she wasn't lying. Victoria pressed harder. And now we see him clinging to a flight attendant, holding her up as some miracle savior. But let's be honest, this is exploitation. He parades her because he cannot face his own inadequacies. He is desperate, Your Honor, and desperation does not equal stability. Her lawyer, Bennett Shaw, nodded approvingly as she returned to her seat. The sting of her attack lingered in the air. Jonathan's attorney, Marjorie Kane, leaned close to him. "You don't have to respond directly," she murmured. "We can redirect later." But Jonathan shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I do." When the judge allowed him to speak, Jonathan rose slowly. The weight of the room pressed down, but he didn't hide from it. He turned first to the judge, then to the jury, and finally to Victoria. "She's right," he said simply. His own counsel stiffened in shock. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Jonathan's voice did not falter. "She's right that I made decisions that hurt children like Caleb. I signed off on cuts I didn't fully understand, because I was too focused on numbers and not enough on lives. I believed efficiency mattered more than empathy. And I was wrong." He turned toward Naomi, who sat in the gallery beside Caleb, her eyes steady but unreadable. "I didn't know then that the same decisions I made in comfort would someday come back to haunt me in my own home. But they did. My son paid for my blindness." The room fell silent. Even Victoria seemed caught off guard. Jonathan took a deep breath. "But here's what else is true. I'm not the same man I was in that boardroom. My son is teaching me to listen, to slow down, to lead differently. And Naomi Brooks, yes, a flight attendant, yes, someone you dismiss as staff, has shown me what it means to truly see him. She has not replaced me. She has helped me become the father I should have been." His voice cracked, raw but unashamed. "I don't stand here pretending I've been perfect. I stand here owning my failures. But I also stand here promising that I will not walk away again. Stability is not about perfection. It's about presence. And I am here." The judge's gavel struck once. Order. The murmurs quieted. Jonathan returned to his seat, his pulse hammering. He felt exposed, stripped of every defense he had relied on for decades. But he also felt lighter, as if by finally naming his guilt, he had begun to release it. Victoria leaned toward her lawyer, whispering furiously. Her composure was cracking now, hairline fractures forming in her mask of control. Naomi glanced at Jonathan across the room. For a brief second, her eyes softened acknowledgement, not absolution. Caleb pressed the toy car into her hand, then pointed toward his father. It was a gesture so small most would have missed it. Naomi didn't. She passed the car back to Jonathan when he sat down. Jonathan closed his hand around it, feeling the cool plastic as if it were made of iron. Caleb had chosen to connect. That mattered more than any verdict. When proceedings adjourned for the day, Jonathan lingered outside the courthouse. Cameras swarmed, reporters firing questions, flashes exploding like fireworks. He shielded Caleb with his body, guiding him toward the waiting car. Naomi stayed close, her calm presence a shield of its own. Inside the SUV, silence settled. Caleb traced the window with his finger, drawing invisible shapes. Jonathan leaned back, exhausted. "You risked everything in there," Naomi said quietly. "I couldn't lie anymore." Jonathan replied, "Not about what I've done, not about who I am." He turned to her, voice thick. "You deserve to hear it, too." Naomi's expression held no triumph, only a weary kind of respect. "Truth costs, Jonathan, but it also frees." Jonathan nodded. "Then I'll pay the cost, whatever it is." As the car pulled away, Caleb reached across the seat. His hand found Jonathan's. Jonathan squeezed gently. The simplest contract he had ever signed and the only one that truly mattered. The next morning, the courthouse steps were a battlefield. Satellite vans lined the curb, anchors rehearsed their lines while cameras rolled. Headlines already screamed from the newsstands, "Waitress" or "Opportunist," the woman at the center of Hale custody battle. Naomi kept her head down as she entered with Jonathan and Caleb. The air pulsed with questions hurled her way. "Are you in love with Mr. Hale? Are you using this child for your own gain? How much are you being paid?" She said nothing, but each word struck her like a pebble against glass, threatening to shatter her composure. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Victoria sat with a triumphant gleam, her team shuffling papers. Jonathan felt the air shift. He knew they were going to weaponize Naomi against him. Sure enough, Bennett Shaw rose first. "Your Honor, today we must address the undue influence of one Ms. Naomi Brooks. She is no neutral party. She's the subject of sensational headlines, a woman with every motive to seek attention, money, or more." He paced in front of the jury box. What kind of stability is it when a billionaire CEO invites a waitress from an airplane into his son's life? Is this not reckless, inappropriate, dangerous? Even Naomi sat still, but Jonathan saw her fingers tighten around the edge of her seat. He wanted to stand, to shield her from the arrows being loosed, but protocol bound him to silence for now. Shaw's attack sharpened, and let us not forget, Brooks was once employed as a teacher, but she is no longer in that field. Why? Because she failed. She could not keep her job, and now she seeks relevance by attaching herself to this case. Gasps echoed. The gallery stirred. Naomi's face remained calm, but Jonathan could see the flicker of hurt in her eyes. Marjorie Kane objected, irrelevant and inflammatory. "Overruled," the judge said, though her tone carried disapproval. Jonathan felt his pulse hammer. He remembered Naomi's words in the SUV Truth Costs, but it also frees. This was his cost to pay. When the time came for cross-examination, Jonathan leaned forward and whispered urgently to Kane, "Let me speak, not as a CEO, as a father." Kane hesitated, then nodded slowly. Jonathan stood. He didn't address the jury first. He looked at Naomi. Her eyes met his, wide with uncertainty. Then he turned to the bench. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has attempted to paint Naomi Brooks as opportunistic, unstable, even dangerous, but I will tell you exactly who she is. She is the woman who fed my son when I could not. She is the woman who saw him when others, including myself, looked away. And she is the reason Caleb began to eat, began to trust, began to speak again." He let the words hang, raw and heavy. She did not fail at teaching. She was failed by a system that values profit over children, by my company, by me, and yet, when she saw my son struggling, she did not turn away out of bitterness or anger. She chose compassion. She chose love, not because of what she could gain, but because of who she is. The courtroom was still now. Every face turned toward him. Even Shaw's rhythm faltered. Jonathan's voice dropped lower. If that makes her a risk, then the world is upside down. If compassion is a liability, then perhaps we should all be so reckless. Naomi's composure cracked just slightly. Her lips parted, her breath trembling. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears she didn't want anyone to see. Caleb, in the gallery, pressed his small hands against the wooden railing and whispered, audible only to Naomi, Mama Naomi. The hush broke into stunned murmurs. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his heart. Then he turned back to the judge. I do not deny my faults. I own them. But the truth is simple. My son thrives with Naomi in his world, and I will not allow her to be diminished for the very qualities that saved him. The judge's gavel cracked once. Order. But order was fragile. Outside, the press would devour these moments. Inside, the balance had shifted. The jury leaned in, not away. The narrative of opportunism had faltered against something harder to discredit love witnessed in real time. When the session adjourned, Jonathan walked beside Naomi. Cameras flared like lightning, but he blocked them with his frame. You shouldn't have had to endure that, he murmured. Naomi shook her head, voice low. It's not me I worry for. It's Caleb. Jonathan paused, meeting her gaze. Then we protect him. Together, for the first time since the trial began. Naomi allowed herself to nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was trust. A fragile beginning. As they stepped into the evening air, Caleb clutched both their hands, weaving them together in his own small grip. The world could hurl its questions, its judgments, its doubts. But in that moment, Jonathan felt something more powerful than the headline's unity, born in fire. The final day of the custody hearing dawned gray and heavy. The sky over Chicago cloaked in low clouds. The courthouse steps were slick with rain. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, their cameras still relentless. Jonathan carried Caleb through the storm of flashing lights, Naomi close at his side. Today, everything would be decided. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut, electric. The jury had been excused. This was a bench decision. Judge Fairchild, her expression unreadable, shuffled through papers as silence fell. Before the ruling, both parties were permitted closing arguments. Bennett Shaw rose first, his words sharp, his cadence rehearsed. Your Honor, what we have witnessed here is a billionaire clinging to appearances. Mr. Hale has leaned on a waitress, paraded her as proof of his supposed transformation. While neglecting the truth, his life is unstable, his choices reckless, his company complicit in the very struggles his son now endures. Caleb Hale deserves stability, and only my client, his mother, can provide that. Victoria sat perfectly still, her face a portrait of control. But Jonathan noticed the faint tightening around her mouth, the hint of nerves. Then Marjorie Kane stood for Jonathan's side. She didn't pace, didn't grandstand. She let her voice carry the weight of simplicity. Your Honor, what this case has shown is not recklessness, but growth, not instability, but resilience. Jonathan Hale has faced his own failures, something few men of his stature ever admit publicly. And yet, in doing so, he has proven what matters most, that he is present, learning, willing to change. Caleb Hale does not need perfection. He needs love, patience, and consistency. He has that with his father. He has that with the community Jonathan is building for him. To tear him away now would not protect him. It would harm him. Her voice softened. This is not a case about class or status. It is about a boy who has begun to eat, to speak, to connect again, not because of money, but because of love. Let us not forget who this is truly about. The judge nodded once, gravely, then motioned for silence. Jonathan's heart thundered as Judge Fairchild began. Custody decisions are never simple. They require us to look not at wealth, not at reputation, but at the best interests of the child. She glanced at Caleb, who sat quietly between Naomi and a court aide, his small hands folded around his toy car. The court recognizes Mr. Hale's prior failures. His decisions as a businessman caused harm to programs that might have helped children like his son. This truth cannot be ignored. However, the court also recognizes his accountability, his willingness to confront those failures, and his evident commitment to growth as a father. She paused, letting the words settle. The testimony of Ms. Brooks has further illustrated Caleb's progress. While she is not a parent, her role in his life has been significant, and her expertise undeniable. The court sees her not as a replacement for parental responsibility, but as evidence of the support system Caleb now has. Jonathan's breath caught. The judge leaned forward. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that full custody will remain with Mr. Jonathan Hale. However, this comes with conditions enrollment in ongoing autism support services, family therapy, and the establishment of a structured care plan reviewed quarterly. Ms. Lang will retain visitation rights. But this court is not persuaded that removing Caleb from his current environment would serve his best interests. For a moment, silence hung heavy, and the gavel struck once, echoing like a bell of release. Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief. Caleb leaned against Naomi, unaware of the legal gravity but sensing the shift in the adult's energy. Victoria stiffened, her jaw tight, eyes flashing with fury. She rose abruptly, heels clacking against the floor as she swept out of the courtroom without a word. Shaw scrambled after her, his briefcase swinging awkwardly. Reporters erupted outside, but inside. Jonathan turned first to Naomi. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking. Naomi shook her head gently. "Don't thank me. Thank him." She nodded toward Caleb, who was tapping his toy car against Jonathan's hand. Jonathan knelt down, eye to eye with his son. Caleb's lips moved, halting, but the sound came. "Daddy. Home." Jonathan's chest swelled. Tears blurred his vision as he nodded. Yes, Caleb. Home. Always. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan moved quickly to act on his promises. He convened his board, not in the glass tower of Hale Global, but in a modest community center. He announced the creation of the Hale Foundation for Autism Support, pledging millions to rebuild programs like the one Naomi had lost. He placed her at its head, with full authority. At the foundation's opening, children filled the halls with laughter and sound. Naomi guided them with practiced patience, her eyes glowing with purpose restored. Jonathan stood at the back, Caleb holding his hand, watching as the world he once broke began to heal. Later, in the quiet of their home, Jonathan tucked Caleb into bed, The boy held his toy car tightly, whispering fragments of new words learned in therapy. His progress slow but steady. Jonathan sat beside him, humming softly the same melody Naomi once used. Caleb's breathing slowed, calm, at peace. Naomi appeared in the doorway, her presence warm against the shadows. Jonathan met her gaze, gratitude unspoken yet understood. "Sometimes," she said softly, "love begins where pride ends." Jonathan nodded, his hand brushing Caleb's hair. "Then I'm glad my pride ended here." As the night settled, Jonathan realized that this was not the conclusion of their story, but the beginning, a family, unconventional yet whole, a future rebuilt not on power or profit, but on something far stronger, love that chose to stay. At its heart, this story is not about wealth, power, or even a courtroom victory. It is about the courage to see beyond status and pride, and to recognize the quiet power of compassion. Jonathan Hale learned that no amount of influence could replace presence. His greatest transformation came when he listened, truly listened to his son, and to the woman who refused to let Caleb be invisible. For older audiences, this message carries a special weight. Life often teaches us that success is measured in achievements and possessions. Yet, the moments that endure are those when we choose connection over control. Naomi Brooks' simple act of kneeling beside a child reminds us that dignity lies in meeting people where they are, not where we expect them to be. The lesson is universal. We cannot undo past mistakes, but we can choose differently today. Whether with children, friends, or strangers, the smallest gestures of empathy can heal wounds that power and wealth cannot touch. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Stories like this remind us of the power of empathy and the hope that lives in small, ordinary moments. If this touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep spreading stories that inspire love, dignity, and change.